Welcome, wary travelers of the dark, to Throne of Nightmares. This is a place where shadows whisper secrets, where the forgotten claw their way back from oblivion, and where the past refuses to stay buried. I am your host, the keeper of tales too grim for daylight, and tonight we venture deep into the frost-bitten heart of a story that will chill your soul. Close your eyes if you dare, and let the darkness guide you. But beware, some stories don't let you go once they've taken hold. Picture a jagged mountain range, its peaks clawing at a sky bruised with storm clouds. The year is 1903, and deep in the Colorado Rockies, where the air is thin and the nights are long, sits a lonely boarding house. Its weathered timbers groan under the weight of secrets, and its windows flicker with lamplight that seems to pulse like a heartbeat. This is the Blackthorn Boarding House, a name that locals speak only in hushed tones. To the lost, the desperate, or the wayward, it promised shelter, warmth, and a hot meal. But for those who crossed its threshold, it offered something far darker. A hospitality that served death itself. Tonight's tale is not one of ghosts or ghouls, though you may feel their presence. It is a story of human hands stained with blood, of smiles that hid venom, and of two sisters whose names became synonymous with dread, Margaret and Evelyn Blackthorn. The keepers of this mountain refuge were women of grace and charm, their laughter as warm as the fire in their hearth. Travelers spoke of their kindness, their generosity, their almost unearthly ability to make a stranger feel at home. But beneath their welcoming facade, something sinister stirred. Men checked in, their pockets heavy with gold dust or dreams of a new life. Few checked out. Those who did well, they were never quite the same. What drove these sisters to turn their sanctuary into a slaughterhouse? Was it greed, madness, or something older? Something that whispered to them from the shadows of those ancient mountains? The truth is a labyrinth, and as we descend into it, you'll find no comfort in the answers. This is deadly hospitality, the sisters who served death in a mountain boarding house. So, pull your chair closer to the fire, listener. The night is cold, and this story it bites. Let's begin where all dark tales do, at the edge of hope, where the promise of safety becomes a trap. The Blackthorn Boarding House wasn't always a name that inspired fear. In the early days of the Colorado Gold Rush, it was a beacon for prospectors, wanderers, and dreamers chasing veins of wealth in the mountains. Built in 1898, it stood at the crossroads of a treacherous pass, a place where blizzards could bury a man in hours and the wind carried voices that weren't there. The sisters, Margaret and Evelyn, arrived with little fanfare, their past as murky as the snow-choked ravines. They were young, beautiful, and poised, with eyes that seemed to see straight through you. To the miners, they were angels in a God-forsaken land. To the mountains, they were something else entirely. The boarding house itself was a marvel of survival, its walls hewn from the bones of the forest, its chimney puffing smoke like a dragon's breath. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine stew and something faintly metallic, something you might not notice unless you lingered too long. Margaret, the elder sister, was the face of the operation, her voice soft as velvet as she greeted guests. Evelyn, younger and quieter, moved like a shadow, her hands always busy with a knife or a needle. Together, they crafted an illusion of comfort so perfect that no one questioned why the guest book never filled or why the attic door was always locked. But the mountains keep their secrets poorly. By 1903, whispers began to spread. A prospector who'd stayed at Blackthorn vanished, his pack found abandoned in a gulch. A trapper swore he saw a figure dragging something heavy through the snow at midnight. And then there were the dreams. Guests spoke of nightmares, where the sisters' faces twisted into something monstrous, their laughter echoing like a funeral bell. The locals, superstitious and wary, began to avoid the boarding house. But for those who had no choice, the lost, the stranded, the desperate, the Blackthorn sisters were waiting, their smiles as sharp as the knives they kept hidden. Tonight, we'll unravel the truth behind their deadly hospitality. We'll walk the creaking halls of the Blackthorn boarding house, peer into its shadowed corners, and dig into the earth where the answers lie buried. But be warned, listener, some truths are better left in the dark. Are you ready to step inside? The wind howled through the Blackthorn Pass on a November night in 1903, carrying the scent of pine and something sharper. Something like iron. Thomas Hargrove, a prospector with a weathered face and a satchel full of dreams, trudged toward the faint glow of the boarding house. He was 34, a man who'd seen his share of hardship, but the promise of a warm bed and a hot meal kept his legs moving. The snow was relentless, piling against his boots, and the cold bit at his fingers like a living thing. When he saw the boarding house's silhouette against the storm, he whispered a prayer of thanks. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. Margaret Blackthorn greeted him at the threshold, her auburn hair glowing in the lamplight, her smile as inviting as a summer dawn. "Come in, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "You look half frozen. We'll fix you right up." Behind her, Evelyn moved silently, setting a table with a steaming bowl of stew. The room was cozy, almost too perfect, with embroidered curtains and a fire that roared a little too brightly. Thomas, exhausted and grateful, didn't notice the way Evelyn's eyes lingered on his satchel or the faint tremor in the floorboards beneath his feet. The Blackthorn sisters were masters of their craft. Margaret, at 28, was the charmer, her laughter disarming even the most cautious traveler. She'd spin tales of her childhood in Boston, though no one could ever verify her stories. Evelyn, 24, was her opposite, silent, watchful, her pale hands always moving. Guests often remarked on her skill with a carving knife, how she could slice a roast so thin you could see through it. Together they created an atmosphere of warmth that masked the cold truth. The Blackthorn boarding house was a spider's web, and its guests were the flies. Thomas Hargrove wasn't the first to fall into their trap, nor would he be the last. The sisters had been running the boarding house for 5 years, and in that time, dozens of men had passed through its doors. Prospectors mostly, drawn by the gold rush that had turned Colorado into a land of fevered dreams. Many carried their wealth in leather pouches, gold dust, nuggets, or cash earned from a lucky strike. The sisters took note of every detail, the weight of a man's bag, the gleam in his eye, the way he spoke of his plans. They were patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. That first night, Thomas ate heartily, praising the stew's rich flavor. "Best meal I've had in months," he said, unaware of the faint bitterness beneath the spices, a bitterness that would soon pull him into a deep, dreamless sleep. Margaret smiled, refilling his glass with cider that carried a faint, acrid tang. Evelyn watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. By midnight, Thomas was slumped in his chair, his breathing slow and heavy. The sisters exchanged a glance, and the real work began. The boarding house had a secret, one hidden beneath its polished surface. The cellar, accessible only through a trapdoor in the kitchen, was no ordinary storage space. Its walls were damp, its air thick with the scent of earth and something fouler. Here, the sisters brought their guests, those who wouldn't be missed, those whose wealth could be quietly claimed. A narrow tunnel, carved into the mountain itself, led to a hidden chamber where the earth was soft and the shadows deep. No one knows how many bodies were buried there, but the soil was heavy with their weight. Thomas Hargrove's fate was sealed the moment he crossed the threshold. His satchel, heavy with gold dust, was emptied by dawn. His body, wrapped in a burlap sack, was dragged through the tunnel and buried beneath a layer of frost-hardened dirt. The sisters worked in silence, their movements practiced and precise. By morning, the boarding house was spotless, the fire roaring as if nothing had happened. Margaret added a new entry to the guest book, her handwriting elegant and unhurried. Thomas Hargrove departed November 12, 1903. But the sisters weren't infallible. The mountains, as I said, keep their secrets poorly. A trapper named Amos Reed, who'd stayed at the boarding house a month earlier, had grown suspicious. He'd woken in the night to the sound of footsteps in the attic, though Margaret swore it was just the wind. He'd noticed the way Evelyn's hands trembled when she poured his coffee, and the faint stain on her apron that looked too dark for berry juice. Amos didn't stay long, but he carried his unease back to the nearby town of Silverton, where he shared his story over whiskey at the saloon. By late 1903, the whispers had grown louder. A prospector's wife reported her husband missing after he'd written of staying at Blackthorn. A hunter found a bloodied glove near the pass, its owner nowhere to be found. The locals, already wary of the sisters' isolation, began to weave their own tales. Some said the boarding house was cursed, built on an old Ute burial ground. Others whispered of a pact with something darker, something that demanded blood in exchange for the sisters' uncanny luck. Whatever the truth, the Blackthorn boarding house was no longer a place of refuge. It was a place to be feared. As winter deepened, the sisters' hospitality grew bolder. They took in more guests, their smiles never faltering, their stew never running dry. But the mountains were watching, and the weight of their crimes was growing too heavy to hide. Something was coming for Margaret and Evelyn Blackthorn, something as cold and merciless as the storms that battered their home. By December 1903, the Blackthorn boarding house stood like a lone sentinel against the fury of winter. The snow fell in sheets, burying trails and muffling screams. Inside, the sisters carried on as if untouched by the growing suspicion in Silverton. Margaret's laughter still filled the dining room, and Evelyn's knife still gleamed in the firelight. But the air had changed. The boarding house felt heavier, its shadows longer, as if the walls themselves were beginning to whisper. One guest, a drifter named Samuel Kane, arrived just before Christmas. He was different from the others, wary, sharp-eyed, with a revolver tucked into his belt. Samuel had heard the rumors in Silverton, tales of men who vanished after staying at Blackthorn. But he was desperate, stranded by a blizzard that had closed the pass. Margaret welcomed him with her usual warmth, but Samuel noticed the way her smile didn't reach her eyes. He noticed, too, the locked attic door and the faint scratches on its frame, as if something had tried to claw its way out. That night, Samuel ate sparingly, sipping his cider with caution. He pretended to sleep, his hand resting on his revolver beneath the blanket. At midnight, he heard it, a soft creak, then the sound of footsteps descending the stairs. Peering through a crack in his door, he saw Evelyn, her face pale as bone, carrying a tray with a single glass of water. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, like moonlight on oil. She paused outside his room, listening before moving on. Samuel's heart pounded, but he stayed still, waiting for dawn. The next morning, Samuel confronted Margaret. "What's in the attic?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. Margaret laughed, brushing off the question with a story about storing old furniture. But Samuel wasn't convinced. He lingered in the common room, watching Evelyn as she cleaned, her movements too precise, too controlled. When she left to fetch firewood, Samuel slipped into the kitchen and found the trapdoor. It was locked, but the hinges were loose, as if they'd been opened and closed countless times. He didn't dare pry it open. Not yet. Samuel's suspicions were a spark in a tinderbox. The sisters, sensing his unease, grew reckless. That night, they doubled the dose in his cider, but Samuel poured it into the fire when Evelyn wasn't looking. The flames hissed, spitting a sickly green spark. When the sisters came for him, expecting a drugged man, they found Samuel wide awake, his revolver aimed at their hearts. "Show me the cellar," he said, his voice like gravel. Margaret's smile faltered, and Evelyn's hands twitched toward her apron. What happened next is a matter of legend, pieced together from Samuel's account and the fragments found later. The sisters led him to the cellar, their faces masks of calm. But as they descended, Evelyn lunged, her knife flashing. Samuel fired, and Evelyn fell, her blood pooling on the stone floor. Margaret screamed, a sound that wasn't entirely human, and fled into the tunnel. Samuel, shaken but determined, followed, his lantern casting wild shadows on the walls. The tunnel led to a chamber, its air thick with the stench of decay. Samuel's lantern revealed the truth: a dozen burlap sacks, some stained with dark, crusted patches. Bones jutted from the earth, and a rusted pickaxe lay in the corner, its handle worn smooth. Margaret was there, clawing at the dirt as if trying to bury herself. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't us. It was her." Samuel didn't wait for an explanation. He dragged Margaret back to the boarding house, bound her, and sent for the sheriff. The sheriff's men arrived 2 days later, battling through the storm. They found Margaret pale and muttering about her woman in the walls. Evelyn's body was gone, though the bloodstains remained. The cellar revealed its horrors: 17 bodies, some fresh, others little more than bones. The guest book, when examined, showed names that matched missing persons reports from as far back as 1899. The sisters' wealth, gold, cash, and jewelry, was hidden in the attic behind the locked door Samuel had noticed. But the story doesn't end there. Margaret was taken to Silverton, where she awaited trial. She spoke of a presence in the boarding house, something that had whispered to them since they arrived. "It told us what to do," she said, her eyes wide with terror. It was hungry. The townsfolk dismissed her words as madness, but some remembered the old Ute legends of a spirit that haunted the pass. A spirit that fed on greed and despair. When the boarding house was searched again, Evelyn's body was still missing. Some swore they saw her shadow moving in the windows, even after the place was abandoned. The Blackthorn boarding house was burned to the ground in 1904, its timbers reduced to ash. But the pass never felt clean. Travelers reported strange lights in the snow, and miners claimed they heard laughter on the wind. The sisters' story became a legend, a cautionary tale whispered in saloons and around campfires. But what was the truth behind their crimes? Was it greed, madness, or something older? Something that still lingers in the mountains. To understand the horror of the Blackthorn sisters, we must step back into the world that shaped them, a world of desperation, ambition, and shadows. The year is 1903, and the Colorado Rockies are a crucible of human dreams and nightmares. The gold rush, which began in the 1850s, has transformed the region into a magnet for fortune seekers. Men and women from across the world flood the mountains, chasing veins of gold and silver that promise wealth beyond imagination. But the Rockies are unforgiving. Blizzards, avalanches, and starvation claim as many lives as the mines themselves. For every man who strikes it rich, 10 others vanish into the wilderness, their fates unknown. Boarding houses like Blackthorn's were lifelines in this harsh landscape. Scattered along treacherous passes, they offered shelter to miners, trappers, and travelers caught in the mountains' grip. These establishments were often run by women who saw opportunity in the gold rush's chaos. Some were widows, others outcasts, but all were survivors, carving out a living in a world that offered little mercy. Margaret and Evelyn Blackthorn fit this mold, at least on the surface. Their boarding house, built in 1898, was one of dozens that dotted the Rockies, each a beacon in the dark. But the Blackthorn boarding house was different. Its isolation, perched in a narrow pass, made it both a haven and a trap. The nearest town, Silverton, was a day's ride away in good weather, and the pass was notorious for its sudden storms. Local Ute tribes avoided the area, calling it Teesgahee, the place of shadows. Their legends spoke of a spirit that haunted the mountains, a shapeless entity that fed on human greed. White settlers dismissed these stories, but the Ute knew better. The land had a memory, and it was not kind. The gold rush wasn't just a hunt for wealth. It was a cultural upheaval. The promise of gold drew people from every corner of the globe. Irish immigrants, Chinese laborers, freed black men, and desperate women fleeing poverty or scandal. But it also bred lawlessness. Mining camps were rough, violent places where disputes were settled with knives or guns. Missing persons were common, their disappearances chalked up to accidents or desertion. In this chaos, the Blackthorn sisters found their opportunity. Who would notice a few missing prospectors in a land where men vanished daily? Greed was the heartbeat of the gold rush, and it pulsed through every story of the Blackthorn sisters. Their victims were mostly men traveling alone, their pockets heavy with gold dust or cash. The sisters' method: Poison, likely arsenic or strychnine, was as old as crime itself. Poison was a woman's weapon, subtle and silent, requiring only a smile to deliver. In the 19th century, female poisoners were a source of fascination and fear, their crimes challenging the era's ideals of feminine virtue. The Blackthorn sisters, with their polished manners and secluded boarding house, were the perfect predators. But there's more to their story than greed. The Ute legends of Tisagahi linger like a shadow over the Blackthorn boarding house. The spirit, said to take the form of a woman with hollow eyes, was known to prey on those consumed by desire, whether for gold, power, or survival. Some accounts claim the Ute warned early settlers about the pass, but their words were ignored. By 1903, the boarding house's reputation was already tainted. Locals spoke of strange lights in the windows, of screams carried on the wind. When Margaret Blackthorn spoke of a woman in the walls, was she raving, or was she confessing to something older, something that had taken root in her and Evelyn? The historical record is sparse, but newspaper clippings from Silverton's Durango Herald paint a grim picture. Between 1899 and 1903, at least 20 men were reported missing in the Blackthorn Pass area. Some were prospectors, others travelers passing through. The sisters' guest book, recovered after their arrest, listed 47 guests, but only a handful were ever seen again. The cellar's grim harvest, 17 bodies, confirmed the worst fears. Forensic analysis, primitive by today's standards, suggested poison as the cause of death, though the bodies were too decomposed to be certain. The sisters' wealth, hidden in the attic, included gold dust, jewelry, and even a child's locket, its owner unknown. The cultural context of the time adds another layer of dread. Women like Margaret and Evelyn were anomalies, independent, unmarried, and thriving in a man's world. This made them objects of both admiration and suspicion. In Victorian America, women were expected to be nurturing, submissive, and moral. The idea of women as killers, especially poisoners, was a cultural nightmare, a betrayal of everything society held sacred. The Blackthorn sisters' story tapped into these fears, their beauty and charm making their crimes all the more horrifying. The Ute legends, too, carry weight. The Rockies were sacred to the Ute, a land of spirits and stories. The Tisagahi was not just a ghost but a warning, a reminder that the mountains demanded respect. When the boarding house burned in 1904, some said it was the townsfolk purging a curse. Others believed the fire was set to hide something worse, something that couldn't be explained by human hands. The pass remains empty today, a place where even modern hikers feel a chill they can't name. The story of the Blackthorn sisters is more than a tale of murder. It's a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature. At its core, it's a story about hunger, not just for gold, but for power, control, and survival in a world that offered little mercy. The sisters' crimes, horrific as they were, reflect universal fears. The fear of betrayal, the fear of the unknown, and the fear of what lies within us all. Let's peel back the layers of this nightmare and ask, what drove Margaret and Evelyn to become monsters, and why does their story still haunt us? The psychological underpinnings of the Blackthorn sisters' actions are a labyrinth of motive and madness. Greed is the obvious answer. Their attic hoard of gold and jewelry speaks to that. But greed alone doesn't explain the scale of their crimes, the methodical precision with which they poisoned, killed, and buried their victims. Margaret's charm and Evelyn's silence suggest a partnership born of necessity, each sister playing a role in a deadly dance. Were they sociopaths, devoid of empathy? Or were they shaped by a trauma we'll never know, their past as buried as their victims? Consider the boarding house itself, a symbol of hospitality turned predatory. In 1903, a boarding house was a sanctuary, a place where strangers could find warmth and safety. The sisters perverted this sacred trust, turning nurture into destruction. This betrayal taps into a primal fear, the idea that those who offer us shelter might be our undoing. It's a fear as old as folklore, from Hansel and Gretel's witch to the sirens of Greek myth. The Blackthorn sisters embody this archetype, their beauty and kindness a mask for something ravenous. The Ute legend of Tisgahi adds another layer. If we entertain the possibility of a supernatural influence, the sisters become vessels for something older, something tied to the land itself. The Rockies are a place of raw, untamed power, where human ambition often meets a brutal end. The Ute believed the mountains were alive, their spirits capable of punishing those who took too much. Did the sisters hear a voice, as Margaret claimed? Was Tisgahi real, or was it a manifestation of their own guilt, a way to externalize the horror of their actions? Thematically, the story speaks to the cost of ambition. The gold rush was a fever dream, a promise of wealth that drove men and women to madness. The Blackthorn sisters, like their victims, were caught in this cycle of desire. But where their guests sought gold, the sisters sought something else, control, perhaps, or a way to defy the world that had cast them out. Their isolation, both geographic and social, mirrors the alienation of the gold rush itself, where trust was a luxury few could afford. The gendered aspect of their story is impossible to ignore. As women in a patriarchal world, Margaret and Evelyn were outliers. Their independence, their success, made them suspect even before their crimes were uncovered. When their murders came to light, they became monsters in the public imagination, not just killers, but women who had defied their natural roles. This fear of female agency runs through history, from the Salem witch trials to the poisoners of the Victorian era. The Blackthorn sisters' story is a dark reflection of this cultural anxiety, their beauty and charm making their betrayal all the more terrifying. Psychologically, the sisters' partnership is fascinating. Margaret, the charismatic leader, and Evelyn, the silent enforcer, suggest a dynamic of dominance and submission. Did Evelyn act out of loyalty, fear, or something else? Her disappearance, her body never found, adds a layer of mystery. Was she a victim of Margaret's manipulation, or was she the true mastermind? Her silence a mask for cunning. The lack of answers is part of what makes the story so haunting. We want to understand, to pin down motive and meaning, but the truth slips through our fingers like snow. The Blackthorn sisters also force us to confront our own capacity for darkness. Their crimes were not impulsive but calculated, planned over years. This premeditation is what chills us, the idea that ordinary people with smiles and kind words can commit atrocities. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a warm fire, a bowl of stew, a welcoming smile. The sisters' story asks us, how well do we know those we trust? And how well do we know ourselves? The enduring power of this story lies in its ambiguity. Were the sisters driven by greed, madness, or a force beyond their control? Was Gahi a myth, a delusion, or something real? These questions linger, like footprints in the snow, refusing to be erased. The Blackthorn boarding house may be gone, but its shadow remains, a warning that hospitality can hide horror, and that the mountains never forget. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the Blackthorn Pass, where the wind still carries the echoes of a hospitality turned deadly. The story of Margaret and Evelyn Blackthorn is a wound in the fabric of history, a tale that refuses to heal. Their boarding house is gone, reduced to ash and memory, but the mountains remember. The snow remembers, and now, listener, so do you. Margaret Blackthorn faced trial in Silverton in the spring of 1904. She spoke little, her eyes fixed on some distant point no one else could see. When asked about the murders, she repeated her claim of a woman in the walls, a presence that had guided their hands. The jury didn't care for her stories. She was sentenced to hang, her execution swift and unceremonious. But Evelyn was never found. Some say she fled into the mountains, her body swallowed by the snow. Others believe she never left the boarding house, her spirit lingering in its ruins. Hikers in the pass still report strange sightings. A woman in a tattered dress, her hands stained red, standing just beyond the tree line. The Blackthorn sisters' story is a puzzle with missing pieces. Were they monsters, driven by greed and cold calculation? Or were they pawns caught in the grip of something older, something that fed on the gold rush's fevered dreams? The truth, like the sisters themselves, is elusive. But perhaps that's what makes this tale so haunting. It's not the answers that chill us, but the questions, the ones that follow us into the dark, that whisper in our dreams. The Blackthorn boarding house was more than a place. It was a symbol of trust betrayed, of the thin line between survival and savagery. In the Rockies, where life was a constant battle against nature and human greed, the sisters turned that battle inward. They became the predators, their hospitality a lure for the unwary. But the mountains, as the Ute knew, have a way of balancing the scales. The sisters' crimes were uncovered, their sanctuary destroyed. Yet the pass remains a place of unease, a reminder that some debts are paid in blood. As we leave the Blackthorn Pass behind, consider this. What lies beneath the surface of the places we trust? The homes we enter, the hands that offer us shelter. How well do we know them? The Blackthorn sisters remind us that safety is an illusion, that the warmest smile can hide the coldest heart. And in the mountains, where the wind carries voices that aren't there, who's to say what's real and what's not? This is Throne of Nightmares, where the forgotten rise to speak, and the past demands to be heard. If this tale has chilled you, if it lingers in your thoughts, then share it with another soul brave enough to listen. And if you ever find yourself in the Colorado Rockies, where the snow falls heavy and the shadows move, tread carefully. The Blackthorn sisters may be gone, but their hospitality, it lingers. Until next time, sleep lightly, listener. The night is full of stories, and not all of them are kind.